Okay, this is the part of the story where I think it's very interesting to consider between Lexington and Concord, and the July vote is 15 months. 15 months by which anything could have happened. 15 months by which there were people who thought, even before the battles of Lexington and Concord, that the only solution in the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies was independence. And others who thought, let's wait and see if England comes to their senses. And of course, others who think, what are you all proposing? Independence is not going to happen without the British trying to stop it, and we have no chance of being successful. So we're going to see the formation of an army after Lexington and Concord, whose express purpose is to, who knows? Because Congress is not going to make that all-important vote until July of 1776. It's the spring of 1775. What happens? What happens in those intervening months? That's what we're going to focus on today. Now we're talking about, again, May 1775 up through the all-important July vote. And finally, in week 10 of the semester, we're going to get these colonies independent. And then obviously we'll talk about the military and social and political events of the American Rebellion as it becomes the American Revolution and the revolutionary changes, possibly, that might happen as a result of independence. Okay. So the British suffered 273 casualties at the battles of Lexington and Concord. I said last time the Battle of Concord and the withdrawal or retreat, depending on what side you take. The British would say, obviously, it's just an organized withdrawal back from Concord to the safety of Boston. We will never see a battle of this kind of scope, where it goes from 20 miles from Concord back to the safety of Boston. The exhausted troops reach Boston, again, where they are protected with cannon and more reinforcements there. The first battles of the American Revolution are like no other. Again, you won't see the scale as far as a 20-mile running battle. That doesn't happen ever again. They're more set-piece battles over the course of a day or days or a campaign or a siege or something like that. The myth of the militia is born early on. This will play out in your reading that you're going to be doing over the next few weeks. The idea that the militia, the volunteer soldiers, the virtuous gentleman who will come to the aid of his country by putting down the plow and picking up the musket and being able to fight on even terms with the British. It's born in this fight. It's reinforced with Bunker Hill, as you're going to find out. This idea that Americans will make good soldiers capable of fighting on even terms with the British, and that we can use militia, short-term soldiers, not long-term enlistments, not paid soldiers or conscripts, people that will have to be forcibly drafted. It's not going to be like the European system. It will be different in America. It's not always going to be to prove that. And one of the debates that happens, one of the battles, it's not a battle of people dying, but it's a battle in the histories of the revolution. They continue to talk about that. Those who write the history say it was the militia that carried the day in the American Rebellion. Then you have soldiers like Joseph Plum Martin, who volunteered, I think, at 15. He's a Connecticut teenager, and who says, look, you're going to hear things about the militia, that they were the ones who made the sacrifices and helped win independence and secure independence. He says, I'm here to tell you that's just not true, because I was eventually enrolled in the Continental Army, and that wasn't the case at all. Okay, the perception by the British is that this is a Boston Rebellion, which quickly changes for them, because now they're beginning to see all of New England. The New England population is up in arms by the thousands, not just by the hundreds that were there at Concord, were there on Battle Road in the aftermath of trying to seize the ammunition in Concord. They're starting to realize that though they may not understand that it's always a vast scale of a conflict, it is a continental conflict after the spring of 1775. Almost immediately, militia from the different colonies begin to converge on Boston in the following weeks after Lexington and Concord. So you have an army created around Boston, What do you do with it? What is its mission? How do you enlist it formally? How long would their enlistments be? How do you choose the officers? There's a lot of logistical issues that have to be handled. In the 6 months that separate the First and Second Continental Congress, the government of the American colonies is in the form of local and state associations. The committees of safety. We know that in many colonies, the official royal governments or the official governments of the colony up to the rebellion no longer exist to operate. It took until the winter for a lot of the bugs to be worked out as far as seizing imports that are coming in, the boycotts, the non-importation agreements, the non-distribution as far as selling what people had on hand, whether that colony would allow people who already, with the boycott going into place, do people who already have some British and European goods already in their stores, are they able to sell those? That is going to depend on the individual town or city or particular colony. Sometimes those items were sold to raise money for the rebellion. Again, and those who opposed it, they were left really in the lurch. Several association committees insisted on people taking loyalty oaths to the rebellious government. You had to sometimes swear to abide by a boycott in public and people, or else. Put a lot of pressure on individuals. Those who refuse are designated by their neighbors Tories. Tories. Loyalists means the same thing. That word is basically interchangeable. But Tories is a reference to people who favor a stronger king. So it goes back to English politics. And it also begins a process of targeting and observation of those folks for their political beliefs. I've said it before, not everyone in the American colonies is favoring this rebellion or resistance or whatever you want to call it at this point. And they become a sustained target throughout the 1770s and 1780s. They're placed under surveillance. They are, as far as these continental associations and committees of safety are concerned, they are hostile to the popular cause. They have to be watched. Their items seized. Everything that the resistance said the English were doing to them, they do upon their neighbor. So that's obviously ironic and, again, very strange. Tories were disarmed, their guns and weapons taken away. In some cases, they were actually incarcerated. Others simply said the best thing for me to do is resign from public office, go back into the shadows, and see how this plays out, or leave the country they knew their whole life, the American colonies. And they think they just have to go back to England or Canada or someplace else. Massachusetts decides to bar Tories from participation in religious ceremonies. But even some people who were loyal to the American cause, as it was called at this point, say this is too much. This is line. They should still be able to worship, even though they're dead wrong about their politics. But these potential for these type of, we might say, actions taken against people for their political views are out there. And some of it, again, is an overreaction. In 1775, the Tories tried to make folks aware of what might happen if the resistance gets its way. We see the onset of a pamphlet war in the different American colonies. The Tories tried to frame the American crisis in a very different light. They say, and this is where they get it wrong and the English get it wrong, that the woes of the English Empire, the dissatisfaction that's in the American colonies to British rule, it's only led by a few scattered troublemakers. And I'm taking a synopsis of what these Tory pamphlets say. And in the synopsis, or kind of an overview, if we see a common theme of the Tory pamphlets, it's that. The idea that it is just a few American rabble-rousers, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, others scattered through the different colonies. They really have at the bottom, they may talk about a break with Great Britain, but below that is a hidden agenda, the Tory pamphlets argue. Independence and democratization. Democracy is a bad word in the 1770s. It means rule by the people, or as some would say, the mob. Congress, the Continental Congress, in these pamphlets, is consistently attacked for not being able to settle with England. So it puts it on them, not England coming to their senses, but the Congress and these rabble-rousers and leaders of the resistance unable to come up with some type of intermediate, moderate position to which they would reach an agreement with England. The pamphlets argue that there can only be one sovereign government, one concentrated area of power. And that is, for the survival of the English Empire, for the survival of the colonies, it is the crown and the different individual governments in the colonies. So they're trying to make a powerful case here for how ludicrous the whispers of independence seem. They also play on class prejudices when they write in their different pamphlets and literature. What they want to do, clearly the resistance has as its goal the two themes, independence, democratization. They're going to take people who are not typically part of politics and elevate them. So they're talking about class warfare, in other words, using a modern term. They're going to elevate and level. They use the term leveling, the leveling of society, where you have people who are, again, not typically represented or would even think of running for public office, now in public office. The leveling also of the economy, the wealthy and the well-to-do, and those who are not as wealthy and fortunate. Leveling and elevating tradesmen and those who do not have property to high office. I mean, to remove the property qualification to either vote or to run for office, that's crazy talk. You don't do that, but that's what you'll get, the Tories say, if this group, the Congress, gets its way. They will confiscate the wealth of the powerful. Again, they play on people's fears. They say things like, they will enter your homes, your castles, carry havoc and devastation, unquote, promises one Tory pamphlet. Undisciplined armed men will be led by unprincipled men. Ravish your wives and daughters, put them under the dagger. The natural order will be turned upside down. Their favorite expression is, the wet pot boils, the scum will rise, unquote. Ouch. But that's what they're saying. In other words, it's going to take the agreed upon hierarchy, the natural order of things, and completely turn it. Leveling is the word that they use. Leveling in politics, sovereignty, where they're now these new people. They often say the new politics. Even John Adams uses the term. The new politics mean that people who are typically not even thinking that they can be viable candidates for office are suddenly thrust into political office. Will they keep it that way throughout the course of events that unfold? Or they go back, the pitchfork and torch crowd, we might call them, go back to deferring to their social betters? Or will they demand that change comes from their being in office? This is unknown. So some people look at this and look forward to it. Others say it is a potential nightmare where they will take your things and that will be the end of it. But in many ways, this is not a legacy of the American Revolution. For everyone looking for the radical change that takes place, an upending of the social order isn't one of those things that happens. It's not at all. The other thing that doesn't happen is these Tories, these enemies of the state, the loyalists, yes, their civil liberties are completely trampled upon. In the same way that those who lead the resistance of Great Britain would have never tolerated it. But at the same time, people leave, the loyalists by the thousands leave during and after the American Revolution, but they may be incarcerated, they may be disarmed, they may be watched, they may be monitored, but they're not driven as far as having to fear death or any kind of a purge of the political system that happens like in other revolutions. So if you're looking for that as a meter by which you say, or a measure, about the revolution being radical, the American Revolution is going to fail because you don't see folks paraded up to the guillotine, massive executions and hanging, firing squads, people exiled to Siberia. I mean, that stuff doesn't happen. And so for some, it's like, well, you know, it just kind of puts the very wealthy Americans and connected in power instead of the English. Okay, maybe that's a change that's significant. Maybe for others, it's not. It's a very conservative revolution. But again, you're beginning to see what folks are warning of. I think it's a great prelude to the change that happens in the 1780s when folks are saying, did we unleash these democratic forces, and should we, kind of put the brakes on them by the 1780s? Maybe that leads to a call for creating a stronger national government and leads to, of course, the Constitutional Convention. But again, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. George Washington, who was 1,000 miles away from what's taking place in Massachusetts, is convinced that after Lexington and Concord, American independence is the only option. Unless the British back down, and this is a reaction after Lexington and Concord when he hears the news, he is ready to go to war. His quote, "A brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's breast. The once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or inhabited by slaves," unquote. He has no hesitation at this point. Independence is the only option. Washington departs Mount Vernon for Philadelphia because he's summoned to attend the Second Continental Congress. He leaves on the 4th of May, 1775, and he brings with him a uniform that he will wear during the proceedings of the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. On April 20th, the day after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, thousands of New England militia begin to surround the British inside of Boston, who have between probably 5,000 and 6,000 soldiers. Unfortunately, they are finding a group of about 16,000, again, only estimates. There is no logistical setup yet to find out how big is your army. I don't know. I mean, it could be this many, but we think it might be as many as 16,000. They're led by, early on, Artemas Ward, who's kind of the first leader, commander of this force, army. Not exactly sure. Again, the uncertainty of what this fighting force will have to carry out is unknown for like a year, May until 1775 to July 1776. Ward decides what we'll do is actually, and I think it's a smart decision, make the men take an oath to serve for the remainder of the war. Some say, okay, sure. I mean, this is the French term is rage militaire. This is enthusiasm for arms. It's going to be a short conflict. The British will come to their senses. There might be one battle and we'll win because look what we did at Lexington and Concord. And then the British will grant us either going back to the way things were in 1763, or they might grant us our independence. Again, the feelings of the soldiers are completely across the board. Some agree in these soldiers, these volunteer soldiers, to take this oath to serve the remainder of the war. Others simply say, the remainder of the war? No, not so much. I'm going to go home. And so the nation is, I think, it's accurate to say, gripped by something of a war fever in the spring of 1775. And the men who are called up from the different colonies to attend the Continental Congress, there's a few more of them, upwards of about 60 who are going to attend the Philadelphia meeting. They're caught up in all of this. You can imagine that these New England delegations especially pass around Boston. They also see soldiers who are marching north from other colonies. And this must encourage them, especially the New England representatives. They're going from New England south. Soldiers are going from the middle colonies to north, passing along the way, and they're saying, yeah, okay, great for you joining the army. And they're saying to the representatives, okay, well, we're volunteering. Now, what's your role going to be politically? Within 2 weeks of the fighting, the delegates begin to trek to Philadelphia. Soldiers greet the delegates, as I mentioned, on the road. There are parades, military reviews, cavalry riders. They begin to give these congressmen who are more radicalized encouragement. Oh, the population supports, again, the American cause. They must feel, these representatives going to Philadelphia, a lot of emboldened, and they can take that attitude of the soldiers and the population to the Congress. And they think at this point, the more radical members, it's going to completely undercut those who want to reconcile with Great Britain. We have popular support. It's obvious. Everyone's on our side. But what course to take next is the critical question. I want to stress again, there is no inevitable foregone conclusion that Lexington and Concord and even Bunker Hill connects a predestination set of dots to get to independence. Not at all. Again, 15 months from Lexington and Concord to the all-important vote. The question is, of course, at the meeting, independence or retreat by the British, to which they restore the rights of Americans. Again, there is a significant group in the Congress. The previous one we know had been splintered. So they sought a middle ground, the First Continental Congress. Okay, we're going to appeal directly to Parliament and to the people. We're going to wait and see what happens. Well, we saw what happens. We have the battles of Lexington and Concord. There is also a splintered group meeting at this second Congress. The moderate faction is led by John Dickinson, which surprises a lot of people in the history of the American Revolution. He was the one who wrote Letters from an American Farmer. And he was the one who, again, wanted a restoration of American rights. They were written around the time of the Townsend duties, moderation, let us be dutiful children was one of the lines from that pamphlet, and also talked about the idea that we should conserve and hopefully will change English policies. But Dickinson, again, one of those moderates. Joseph Galloway from Pennsylvania as well. Pennsylvania has a conservative group there at the Second Continental Congress until they have an election and bring in more and more radicals. The other development that happens is that the war, we might say, takes on a life of its own in the spring of 1775. Troops gather around Boston after Lexington and Concord. One symbolic structure that's often connected to this time after this initial fighting, and even before the battle that takes place at Bunker Hill. Let me pull up our slides here. We're going to talk about the important action that takes place in New York State, and this has to do with, okay, let me show you right here. This is Fort Ticonderoga slideshow. There we go. It's still there. My family somewhere has pictures of me crawling over the cannon on this thing. I was too young to remember it, but I've been there at some point. Upstate New York, Fort Ticonderoga. It's on Lake Champlain, strategically located in New York State. The French had built it in 1755, called it Fort Carillon. We talked about the ineffective British attack against it during the French and Indian War. It is a massive stone fortification that our own General Gage had been a part of and tried to capture in 1758 when it was a French fort. The fort was not in its prime 20 years later. Nevertheless, it had an impressive garrison of, this is a representation of the fact that it wasn't that impressive, 2 officers and 48 men. Again, the British Army is scattered throughout the American colonies. This matters little to folks in New England and New York. Had maybe not a lot of soldiers or officers, but an impressive collection of cannon, artillery. The Army, whatever you want to call the force that is surrounding the British inside Boston, have no cannon. So artillery would be a big deal to get it. There's a rumor that the British commander in Canada, a rumor that is untrue, but it doesn't matter, it's a perception. The British commander in Canada is going to lead a force of British commander leading a French Indians down out of Canada and capture the fort sometime in 1775. They will then replenish the troops, build up the fort, and use it as a base to cut the colonies in two. They'll have, again, New York on one side and New England on the other. It's a popular strategy that the British will try to do in different wars over different eras. Cut the New England colonies off from the rest, and that way the rebellion would end, and it doesn't really work out. Two men determined to prevent this from happening once they get rumors, and this is what's interesting. The orders to make some kind of demonstration, as the military term is, that means, fight for it, take it, a demonstration against Fort Ticonderoga, come from actually the Connecticut Committee of Safety, the Connecticut Provisional Government, the shadow government, the illegal government of that colony, decides they're going to get their own military force to capture Fort Ticonderoga. One of them is this man, Ethan Allen. The other is a New Englander, yes, Benedict Arnold. That Benedict Arnold. Allen had helped settle what are called the Vermont colonies, the Vermont counties, I should say, is the word. Vermont, by the way, is not a colony and will not become a state until after the American Revolution. He has a price on his head in New York because he's trying to get people there to say, if New York will not grant us some kind of our own autonomy, maybe we should branch out and move to create our own colony. And of course, the people in New York are not very happy about that. We know that the colonial charters make a mess of all the boundaries in areas in New England, out west. Later on, Connecticut will claim areas of what's now Michigan. It just goes back to that time period where there were no formal, in some cases, Western boundaries. So you've got a really interesting group here of soldiers that are going to be put together. Allen, and then Arnold was a merchant in Connecticut. At one point, he was an apothecary, a pharmacist, basically, who went through life and hadn't done too much with himself up to this point. But it is a couple of New England colony governments, including the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, that allows both of them. In this case, it is Massachusetts that tells Benedict Arnold, look, you're both authorized now to lead an expedition against Fort Ticonderoga. Here we go. Allen had a head start marching. He's very much before the American Revolution associated with the Green Mountain Boys. The Green Mountains are now New Hampshire and Vermont. The Green Mountain Boys are a group of his followers, kind of a militia force that go just south of the fort in May of 1775. Arnold arrives with his own force assembled in Massachusetts and tries to take command and says, I have a higher rank and a higher, again, ability to lead all of the soldiers. Ethan Allen laughs for a long time. And then when the laughing stops, they decide they're actually going to work together. This force arrives outside of the fort, and acting on no authority from the actual Congress itself, decides to capture Fort Ticonderoga and a fort slightly to the north called Crown Point. This is an artist's rendering of literally the British commander answering the door of the fort. And it is Arnold who says in fully dramatic fashion, it's here in this slide, by what authority, asks his British commander, and he says, in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress, which we're not sure either the great Jehovah or the Continental Congress gave him authority to do this. Nevertheless, they did. So this is the idea that the war is taking on a life of its own, even as Congress, some would say, dithers, others would say, contemplates the next move. This region, along upstate New York, would become a battlefield for the rest of the war. But more important, and this ties into the story you're reading in Bunker Hill, Ty, as it's called, Ty's Guns, Fort Ticonderoga. The value is the guns on the walls, not the fort, because they basically abandon it or keep a small force there, and the British recapture it later in the war. Arnold, meanwhile, has bigger designs than capturing British forts in the winter of 1775, as we're going to find out. But it puts him on the map. This guy is by far the most successful American leader throughout most of the war until he makes that fateful decision to switch sides. The fall of Fort Ticonderoga happens the same day that the Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. So again, the war is taking on a life of its own. We'll go back to the notes. There we go. Okay. So this is what the Congress has to deal with. The war is a reality. It hadn't been the reality in the First Continental Congress the previous fall. So what do? You have to organize this militia. You have to collect arms. You have to organize supplies. You have to find ways to pay for it. You have to name officers. George Washington shows up in a brand new uniform at the Continental Congress to attend the meetings and remind everyone that he had served in the military. If you put him on the spot, he would say, "I'm only here to show Virginia stands with Massachusetts in the aftermath of these battles." To which we would immediately say, yeah, but no one else is wearing a uniform except you. He's advertising that he's available. He has to know in his heart of hearts that he is one of the most qualified individuals because of his experience in the French and Indian War. So Washington, in the short term, is assigned to different committees that Congress breaks up into smaller committees and groups of gentlemen, and he's assigned to those on military matters. And he's noticed by everyone in Philadelphia. When you are 6'3" in a world of men who are 5'7" and 8, when you walk into a room, people's eyes move to you immediately. John Adams is swept up in the martial spirit. "Oh," he says, "that I were a soldier. I will be. I am reading military books. Everybody must and will and shall be a soldier," unquote. So says John Adams. Everyone agrees about this. Soldiers are needed. There's unfortunately disagreement about what these soldiers will actually do. Not exactly clear. In the aftermath of the battles, moderates in Congress decide that they should appeal directly to the king. It is called the Olive Branch Petition. Some radicals say, really? We have to do this? But you appease them. You appease those who want to reconcile. I'll read you part of the Olive Branch Petition, July 1775. "To the king's most excellent majesty, most gracious sovereign," it begins, "we, your majesties, faithful subjects of the colonies of so-and-so and so-and-so, entreat your majesty's gracious attention to our humble petition." Towards the end, there's one particular paragraph that will address what the more conservative and reconciliationists want in Congress. "Thus called upon to address your majesty on affairs of such moment to America, and probably to all your dominions, we are earnestly desirous of performing this office with the utmost defense and deference for your majesty, and we therefore pray that your royal magnanimity and benevolence may make the most favorable construction of our expressions on so uncommon an occasion." It's a direct appeal to George III. Why not? The radicals say, all right, let's send this off and see what happens. They don't have any actually hope that it will do anything, but they decide anyway. Most of the members of Congress in attendance were there with the first one, including Franklin, Hancock, Thomas Jefferson. The difference between the first and second Congress is that Georgia arrives. We have all 13 colonies representatives. Sometime in the middle of all of this, they actually send delegations to Philadelphia. At the same time as they send, again, the olive branch, right? The American eagle has the arrows in one talon and the olive branch in the other, because they consider this Congress to adopt this New England army around Boston. The Grand American Army, they're calling it at first. The Grand American Army. Okay. There's a campaign to organize this army because they have nothing to do, they lack discipline, and they are bored. You don't want some people armed, lacking discipline, and bored on what are more and more looks like a glorified camping trip because they are without a purpose at this point. John and Samuel Adams talk at the Continental Congress and decide it's probably a good idea to find someone outside New England, with all due respect to Artemus Ward. Warren's going to be the center of the book you're reading. Philbrick likes Warren. He thinks he's very, very significant, and he is. He thought, if not for what happened to him, things in history might have been a lot different. Nevertheless, it makes sense. And Adams, both of them, the cousins, believe that you have an outsider lead a New England, and an overwhelmingly New England army. That's what it is. It will be augmented from the other colonies, but at the end of the day, it is a New England army. And they decided they're going to nominate Washington. John Hancock thinks he's a leading candidate to be commander of the Grand American Army. Why? He's the wealthiest guy in New England, if not all of the colonies, which apparently should make him the person to lead the army. They then decide to adopt the name of the American Continental Army, which will be shortened to the Continental Army in the course of the American Revolution, and that's the term we will use after they choose the commander. It is John Adams who comes up with the idea, and he will later say he should take all the credit, John Adams, for nominating Washington. He has absolutely too much going for him to not nominate Washington. He's young, he's 43. So he's active and can endure a possibly sustained conflict. He's able. He has a checkered past when it comes to his service in the Virginia Regiment during the French and Indian War. But he's one of a few people who's actually commanded a large group of soldiers, hundreds, maybe a few thousand. This is going to be unlike anything else that he's had to deal with. The logistics of being a commander of all of an army is something they believe only Washington is capable of. Most importantly, Washington, as we saw with his earlier quote, believes in independence. And he says, I will answer to the civilian authority. Politically, I mean, the Virginians probably had to talk to, we can imagine the conversations that took place with the New England and other representatives of the colonies, the idea that, yes, this is what we know of Washington. He is not ambitious to where he's going to take this command of the army and make it into something else if we are successful gaining independence. He's someone who is going to, and does, like 8 years later, resign his commission and give it back to Congress. And so that reassures a lot of people. I mean, you don't want to replace the king and parliament with some kind of military dictatorship or a junto of people around Washington. That's not going to be the case at all. So in the 2 months after the meeting starts, May 1775, the Congress has done a lot. They rejected the peace plan sent by the King's Minister, Lord North. They created an army. They adopted it first, calling it the Grand American Army, then the American Continental Army. Why? It gives us the continental flavor, the idea that, yes, this is a continental-wide rebellion. They put a commander in charge who is from Virginia. And they also petitioned the king personally with the olive branch. They sent the olive branch to the king to wait to see what happens. What is his response? But like the first Congress, as we go into the summer of 1775, like the first Congress, the one that met the previous fall, this Congress still repudiates independence. They're not there yet, but events are happening that might change people's minds. They aren't there yet because they have a very articulate group in Congress that still favors reconciliation. As I mentioned, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania is the leader. He knows he is in a distinct minority. He says out of frustration, "What topics of reconciliation are now left for men who think as I do to address our countrymen? To recommend reverence for the monarch or affection for the mother country? No. While we revere and love our mother country, her sword is opening our veins." The war, as we're going to see in different areas of the colonies, will begin to push those like Dickinson who say the connections just aren't there anymore. It's really difficult to talk about an isolated New England rebellion, as we're going to find out other areas of the colonies flare up in violence. Revulsion from independence, the idea that we cannot break from England, is not irrational. It's not like a question of what's wrong with these conservative members, can't they just get with the program? They have good points. Galloway, Dickinson, and others. Even some members of the group from South Carolina are saying, what is this going to mean? I mean, what is our role? There's questions about the future of slavery as well. Those who are, again, putting the brakes on independence bring up some very good points. The nation, if you create a nation because you declare yourselves independent, will become very vulnerable and in a precarious spot, meaning other countries will be able to swoop in. Like Great Britain obviously isn't going to say, "Oh, you're independent, best of luck with you." No, absolutely not. Lose 13 of their mainland colonies? What if, God forbid, this revolution for export, as some want it to be, affects the Caribbean colonies? That's where the real important money, trade, slaves, property, all exists. France and Spain can quickly pounce on the English weakness and use the colonies for their own end. Some of you in Congress, the more conservative members, are talking about an alliance with a European country who's an enemy of Great Britain. What will they require of us to become an ally and give us money, supplies, uniforms, even send soldiers to our Navy? This is a good point. So the idea of holding off on independence is not that, oh, just what's wrong with these folks? They need to really come around and see that this is the only way to go. It wasn't. This process took over a year. Most who favor a complete break keep their intentions quiet. But they're also in the back of their minds skeptical about mending. This is the group, they will call them in Congress, the Lee Adams. The Lee is of Virginia. The Lee Adams Junto, which means kind of a small secretive group, the Junto. They speak for a group who is ready to declare independence, but they are willing to say, all right, fine, we'll send the olive branch, maybe the king won't do anything. But okay, let's just send it anyway. They also understand that Massachusetts requires attention. They knew that this gathering militia was something more than that. It was an army. It represents one region, but more and more it is effectively, as the name promised, it's becoming a continental army. And again, any reservations you might have about declaring independence, you have to put them aside. A formal break is inevitable. Once you sanction, the Lee Adams people say, when you sanction an army, what else is there? But this is interesting, and this gets back to the idea. This is something we don't stress talking about this time period. The idea that some who favor reconciliation, obviously you can say, how can you support an army in Congress? If you're a member of Congress and say you support the creation, the adoption of this so-called continental army, how can you do that and not say that the army is there to secure independence? And they would say, well, the army is there to secure our rights, short of independence. We don't think of that often. The army is a defensive force. The army is there to show the king and parliament that we want things returned to a state where they existed in 1763. And the army can secure that. And we can secure our rights short of severing all ties with Great Britain. In other words, fight to reconcile. The army isn't there just to fight to become independent. So the army, you can imagine, Washington, among other people, is a bit confused about what the purpose of this force is. So no one is ready to make that move just yet. But in June, they agreed to raise the Continental Army, to adopt the Continental Army. They also agree to borrow money. They also agree to recruit from, especially some of the southern colonies, and Virginia recruits one, a rifle company, and to pay them as well. To pay the soldiers, to pay the officers. Washington will later ask for, before everyone even fights, a pay raise. And then, before Washington can take command in person of this army, we know what happens next. He's going to take command of the army at Cambridge. The armies in the area clash again in June. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill. Not going to get into long details about it, but militia from New England had fortified high ground around Boston, the Charleston Peninsula, area of land. Again, Boston with Massachusetts is kind of a series of land masses that kind of jut out there into the harbor. And the one that's north of Boston is the Charleston Peninsula. And the British, of course, decided, if God help us, this rabble in arms, as they're calling the Continental Army or this militia, whatever it is, were to do something like, get cannon or artillery and literally fire into Boston, it would not be a good thing. So they decide to dislodge the militia force that is there at the Charleston Peninsula. They use the British Navy. There is no Continental Navy yet. So they take the Navy, they float the soldiers from one area of Boston to another and march up, not Bunker Hill, but Breed's Hill. Breed's Hill is where the battle is actually fought. When they get within about 20 paces of the Continental militia there, they unleash a terrible volley. They charge 3 times up Breed's Hill, and they get butchered there. 1,000 casualties, about 25% of their attacking force, which in these type of battles sometimes happens regularly, 25% casualties. If it happened in an American battle in recent memory, and overseas, we would have a bunch of generals testifying in front of Congress saying, what in the hell happened out there? That's a bloodbath, but battles back then often were. So you'll get into all of the details about the Bunker Hill battle. Washington arrives, I want to make this clear, after the battle takes place. So he is there, he sits in some committees, gets the nomination, and gets chosen as the commander. And when it's clear to him that there's going to be a vote on it, he decides, he up and literally jumps out of the room because he doesn't want to be there for the vote and influence anybody. So he leaves, and the vote is there to make him commander. He says, okay, I'm going to depart for the north for Massachusetts. Obviously, it takes him a little bit of time to get from Philadelphia to Massachusetts, and the battle happens in the intervening days. He knew better than to celebrate. I mean, the militia was scattered after they ran out of ammunition and they fled Breed's Hill. But people back in England are saying, heck, if we have 8 more battles like this, we're not going to have anybody to report what happens in North America because all the soldiers will be dead. And so that as far as the Bunker Hill battle, it is a game changer in many ways. It reinforces this idea that, yes, there's going to be more of a reliance on militia. Oh, look what the militia did. They really bloodied the nose of the British attacking force. But Washington understands very early on that this is a collection of militia. It is not an army. It is not an army. He has to try to make it into an army if he can. They're also not, as much as all these soldiers are going around saying, hey, Mr. Washington, man, what do you think about what we did there at Bunker Hill? He said, look, why is your bathroom right behind your tent? I mean, ew, and that's not good for, obviously, sanitation purposes. So you guys don't know what you're doing. You may be patting yourselves on the back after the victory. It's not a victory because the British achieved what they want at Bunker Hill. We have to train this force. His role, even after Bunker Hill, still unclear. Train the army to be used for what? Secure independence? No, because Congress hasn't voted on that yet, because we're still a year away from that taking place. Congress is not even close to a consensus. For now, he says, and in his letters, and he writes a lot of them, and we have just about all of them, he invoked a providence, that's what he usually referred to, a higher power or God, to help him, quote, in the defense of the liberties of Americans. That's the Army's purpose throughout 1775. He faced 5,000 of the best soldiers in the world a well-oiled machine that is broken by discipline. Again, that's what they did in the British Army. They took the individuality out of you and made you a cog in a wheel. This is close quarters combat. Now, you remember, you may hear the line from the book of someone in the militia saying, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. That was pretty good advice because the muskets were very inaccurate that they were carrying. The musket is the main weapon. It is a smooth bore gun, meaning it's not rifled, meaning it's inaccurate. 75 yards, you might have a chance of hitting something. So what did you do to compensate for the fact that the guns are inaccurate? You march shoulder to shoulder. You fire with 2 or 3 ranks deep. In the British Army, you would kneel in the first rank. The second rank would have a rank behind them. You would have a gun literally over your shoulder firing. You masked your fire. You would fire under well-engineered and disciplined volleys. You followed that up by a bayonet charge. Because after firing your gun a couple times, the battlefield would be covered with this bluish, acrid smoke where you couldn't see anything. So you drove your attack home by about a foot-long knife at the end of your gun that you would then intimidate the enemy with, or drive it into the stomach and twist. But this was combat in the 18th century. Discipline, Washington said, is the soul of an army. His army had no discipline. His army wasn't even an army. He had an unprofessional force, militia, temporary soldiers who were civilians, who probably weren't ready to deal with the rigors of campaigns. Worse, they were New England militia, as far as Washington was concerned. They were very democratic in their practices, meaning, the New England people, he couldn't understand. I mean, they vote from everything, from dog catcher all the way up to members of the general court. That's not a world he's familiar with in Virginia. Massachusetts privates elected their officers, meaning the lowest rank, the privates, chose those who were going to be their officers. And very often, the most capable are not chosen. It's more like a popularity contest. Oh, he's a good wrestler. He can tell a good joke. Let's make him basically the captain of this company. And Washington would be like, do you have any experience fighting? Nope. And he'd say, a little bit more of a deferential society that he's used to coming from Virginia. He's always, throughout the war, this will be Washington's dilemma, he's trying to craft a professional army and work with the resources that he has. So all the time, he has to break the rules. Break the rules of traditional ways by which you put together an army. He will, during the course of the American Revolution, campaign in winter. You don't campaign in winter. Armies go into quarters in winter. He does. He will use irregulars, meaning militia, and any other type of scrape-together temporary forces that he could put in play. And he will also enroll as much of the citizenry as is humanly possible. Again, break the rules. Go on the attack when you shouldn't go on the attack. Split your force and go separate ways and attack a larger force, which is a surefire way to get your armies destroyed in detail. Washington tried to make an army. Congress seems willing to wait for a British response. The king expresses outrage at what happens when he gets wind of the Battle of Bunker Hill in August of 1775, calling the colonies in open rebellion. It's one thing to have the Battle of Lexington and Concord, another to literally annihilate 1,000. The Bunker Hill really incites the British population to say, all right, devote more resources to ending this rebellion. And the king, remember, set this in a bigger stage. He has now just received the Olive Branch petition, which has been issued by those conciliatory members of Congress, and the Adams-Lee junto say, fine, we'll send that over, see what the king does. So you can understand that he gets wind of the Bunker Hill battle and the Olive Branch petition about the same time. He's in no mood to even consider the Olive Branch petition. Instead, Parliament followed the lead of the monarch. This is George III putting this in place, demanding it of Parliament, and Parliament is in a mood to follow suit by passing what is called the Prohibitory Act. You see it there in the notes. It essentially stops all trade with the American colonies. John Adams gets wind of the Prohibitory Act. He's shocked. The king has removed the protection of Great Britain from the colonies. Here's Adams. It throws 13 colonies out of the royal protection, levels all distinctions, and makes us independent in spite of our supplications and entreaties. It may be fortunate that the act of independency should come from the British Parliament rather than the American Congress. English translation, folks, they leave us no choice. The options now are gone. From the American Prohibitory Act, here's the quote, that as to the king, we have been bound by him. Sorry, let me start this quote again. This is from the Congress. They're saying, we have been bound by him, the king, by allegiance, but that this bond was now dissolved by his assent to the late Act of Parliament, by which he declares us out of his protection. The Prohibitory Act, now I'm reading directly from it. So we see Adams's reaction, we see Congress's reaction, and it's surprise. Imagine what Dickinson and Galloway think when they hear this. I mean, the ground would be completely cut out from under them. Let me read what the actual words of it say. It prohibits the American colonies from, quote, all manner of trade and commerce. Any ships found trading shall be forfeited to His Majesty as if the same ships were the ships and effects of open enemies. It's the way you treat a foreign combatant. That's what the Prohibitory Act does. The Royal Navy, of course, would enforce it. There is no Continental Navy. It will stop all foreign ships from going to North America. From April 1775 onward, the King and Parliament are the agents that help persuade the Americans to separate. Blood had been spilled twice. Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. Trade was shut down. Words like traitors, the Americans who support the cause, were used. Enemies. Now we are enemies. One of the early books on the Battle of Bunker Hill are called Now We Are Enemies, written, I believe, in the 50s or 60s. And the king. The king refuses to even look at or consider the olive branch petition, a direct appeal to him to ask his help and end the situation. Intervene personally, Your Majesty. No. His reaction is the Prohibitory Act. There you have it. More troops are also on the way from England. They're going to strengthen that force to upwards of 8,000. There's also news that the king has decided to supplement this force by the hiring of Hessian soldiers. They're from the German states. The main area, Germany is not a unified country in 1775. They are German states. One of them is called the Hesse-Kassel region of Germany. That's why all of the soldiers from Germany are just labeled Hessians. They are mercenaries. It is not unprecedented for the king to actually do this, to augment the British fighting force. Sometimes he would have to do it if he's sending soldiers, for example, to North America during the French and Indian War, yet he's also fighting France and enemies of Great Britain on the continent, meaning Europe. The king, remember, he's a Hanover. His grandfather, George II, his primary language was German. And so what happens is the news of the colonies reaches the colonies that they hire these mercenaries. The perception, here we go again, the perception is that the Hessians rape women and kill babies for fun. Is it true? Nope. Does it matter? Absolutely not. When you are on your bended knee asking for mercy, quarter it's called. When you ask for quarter, you are surrendering and you should be treated as a prisoner of war. The Hessians will take the bayonet, stick it in your stomach, and twist. They are merciless soldiers, hired hired from the underlings of German society. They have nothing to lose fighting against these American pig farmers. So adding insult to injury, that's why the hiring of the Hessians. Again, it's not unprecedented. The king has done it, but the fact that he's going to deploy them against his own people, that hurts. And again, we're building a case now. John Adams used to say, you know, it's kind of like a convoy of ships that you want all to cross the ocean at the same time. He's talking about this analogy or metaphor for the Congress. If the stragglers of the convoy fall behind, they'll catch up, or the convoy will slow down to bring everyone along at the same speed. But he's playing the long game. He's being patient. He's allowing the olive branch to go forward. He's basically saying, all right, we'll appeal to Dickinson and Galloway and others who want reconciliation, knowing it's going to be harder and harder as all of these events happen over the 15 months between Lexington and Concord and the all-important vote. Even with all these factors, Congress decides they're going to hesitate. They want to wisely wait until, of course, the population supports. And let's not forget that Congress is carrying out the orders of the different colonies. Congress can't just say, that's it. It's logical that we just vote and use the I word here. But they also have to consider what people back home are thinking about. I mean, you represent Benjamin Franklin, Pennsylvania, Samuel Adams, Massachusetts, John Rutledge, South Carolina. When those people back there support it, you can do it. We often think of a top-down idea where Congress supports the idea and then the colonies, now states, follow. But I'll tell you it's the other way around. You know, by the spring of 1776, it's the colonies saying, what are we waiting for, Congress? Do it! Do it. But you've got to get to that point. So Adams and company, the radicals there, wait. In October of 1775, the Royal Navy squadron fires on Falmouth, Massachusetts, which is now Portland, Maine. Maine was part of Massachusetts, wasn't an independent state until 1820. The 8-hour bombardment reduced the town to ashes, utterly destroys it. Congress decides at this point we're going to christen the United States Navy, 1775, and raise, and this is the birth date of the United States Marines, also to be the element of soldiers on the ships. Colonial governors decide they're going to blunder even more. One of them, we'll go back to the PowerPoint here. So I actually have a slide of this gentleman. They're the Hessian soldiers. These are reenactors, obviously, but this looks like it's near Trenton. Yeah, it is near Trenton, isn't it? Okay, anyway. Okay. The governors on their own. This is the royal governor of the colony of Virginia. The Earl of Dunmore, Lord Dunmore, vows to resist the rebels and raise troops. Through October, he had led raids against a small group of militiamen in the colony of Virginia. He follows that with a proclamation, often called Dunmore's Proclamation. It's November 1775. It sends shockwaves through the South and through all of the colonies. Dunmore's proclamation promises freedom to all rebel-owned slaves who will escape their patriot masters and join him. Dunmore's proclamation. 500 go. It's been called by one historian the largest single escape from slavery in the whole of British America up to that point. That's accurate. The largest slave rebellion up to after the Revolution is the Revolution. 500 go. Now, here's the problem with Dunmore's proclamation. All rebel-owned slaves. But when you make a promise to freedom, you're also endangering the loyal slave owners. Why would any slave say, oh, my owner is loyal to the British government, so I'll just remain a chattel slave? What it's doing, and this is why the British government immediately hears about this and renounces Dunmore's proclamation, says this guy's crazy. I mean, he thinks it's a way to bring about putting down the resistance in Virginia by threatening race war. But the British government is worried that slave owners of loyal Americans, loyal to the crown and to Parliament, are going to participate as well. Slave owners and non-slave owners alike nicknamed Dunmore a monster for this action at the end of 1775. Any loyalty to the royal government in Virginia ends as a result of Dunmore's proclamation. He is now inciting a slave rebellion, the worst fear, and it reverberates beyond Virginia into the other colonies as well. You can imagine South Carolina, which has, for the most part, at least half of its population enslaved, fearing what could happen as a result of Dunmore's promise. Dunmore went even further. He ordered a bombardment by the Royal Navy of Norfolk, Virginia on New Year's Day, 1776. Again, it's the idea that the war is taking its own course. But nothing struck Congress with greater force than what was happening, again, outside of the campaigns, outside of what was taking place with Congress. Now, after Bunker Hill, again, what Congress had done to kind of set this into a larger timeline is after the capture of Ticonderoga and Crown Point in 1775, Congress put the brakes on the New England governments who wanted to lead an invasion of Canada. Then Bunker Hill happened, and they said, okay, maybe we can. There's a perception among members of Congress that the folks there are English, but not very loyal to Great Britain. There are French folks there, obviously, in Canada. And so any attack led on British Canada will be easy as far as the campaign is concerned. And so that campaign is going to be led by eventually Benedict Arnold. And he gets really, really close. The Northern Department of the Continental Army was commanded by a New Yorker. Oftentimes, these folks who were very well connected. His name is Philip Schuyler. His name isn't critical for you to know, other than to tell you he is Alexander Hamilton's future father-in-law. Schuyler and the Congress believe Canada is simply lightly defended. Most of the residents are French, and he has about 3,000 soldiers. And doesn't realize that the British defense in Canada is ready for an attack against Montreal and Quebec. Schuyler also says, I've got Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. It's going to be basically an easy campaign. Schuyler is not able to command. Let me show you this map because it is absolutely part of the story of the Revolution. I don't think a lot of people recognize how close we were, literally, to making Canada maybe the 14th colony. Schuyler isn't able to command in person. The supplies, the logistics plague the expedition, and so he relies mostly on a secondary force, and that is led by none other than, once again, Benedict Arnold. You can see on the map here. Going the wrong way. There we go. Benedict Arnold takes about 1,000 woodsmen and deploys them on a march through Maine. It is an epic march through Maine. The Maine wilderness here, you can see his destination is going to be Quebec, while another army led by another force of American militia and continental soldiers heads towards Montreal. Thankfully, the new commander is able to take over from Schuyler, who kind of just dawdles and doesn't lead the attack. In November, they make their way to the north. Arnold moves on Quebec, though his army is depleted by about 75%. Again, that march through the woods decimated the army. Cold, supplies, lack of food. There was a small force, too small force that can actually lead an attack successfully. But Arnold says, hell, we got here, might as well. It's now December of 1775. He wants the defender of Quebec to come out and face his force on the lines of battle, kind of like what the British wanted from the French when they tried to storm Quebec in 1758, but it didn't happen. He's also facing another issue. The Army's going to go home at the end of the year. The Army had signed up for enlistments throughout the end of 1775. When you get to December 31st, New Year's Eve day, the Army's pretty much done. So he leads the attack on December 31st, 1775. The leader of the expedition, Richard Montgomery, is killed right away. Arnold is wounded, and the attack ends many of his soldiers are captured in the failed attack against Canada. The repulse in Canada was bad enough, but Congress is beginning to become worried about the woes that had hurt the Army. Food, clothing, guns. They were not able to supply this force sufficiently. The lesson to many from this, from the failed Canada expedition in 1775, is that there has to be a need for foreign assistance. We've got to get supplies, uniforms, guns, muskets from somewhere overseas. That's the only hope we have of making it a short conflict. We need money, obviously. And so that's what the Congress decides to do. They're going to actively seek foreign aid into 1776. Yet, how do you approach a foreign country and say, hey, members of Congress who are now meeting with us, the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, we're going to help you, but what's your purpose? And if you are in the early, think about the dilemma. If you're an American diplomat meeting with someone from overseas and you are beseeching them for aid, what's the goal of the aid we provide you? Uncertain, right? Because there's been no vote yet. Reconciliation. Oh, also, there's that whole thing. If you are France and you provide aid to this group of colonies who want, some of whom representatives want things to go back to 1763, are you going to incur the wrath of Great Britain? Thanks, France, for helping our colonies, aiding them to basically let them do whatever they want, go back to a salutary neglect style of governing where there were no taxes or regulations pushed on them. We're going to get back at you, France, for doing that. So that's a difficult spot to be in, because you can go over there and say, oh yeah, our mission here to go to you for aid is a complete severing of ties with Great Britain. And then you say, oh, all right, but it's not. That's not the goal of the Congress in the spring of 1775 and the fall of 1775 or early winter 1776. Okay, we're going to leave this story off for now and pick up with the publication of a small pamphlet written by an Englishman, a failed tax collector and corset maker, who came over with a letter of introduction by Benjamin Franklin. This small pamphlet will argue that it is simply common sense for the colonies to declare themselves independent.